Somewhere in the South Pacific, there is a small triangle of volcanic rock called Rapa Nui. You probably know it as Easter Island. It is one of the most isolated, inhabited places on the planet. The nearest island with people on it is over 1,000 miles away. The nearest continent is more than 2,000. And standing on that island, with their backs to the sea, are about 900 enormous stone faces. You have seen them. Everyone has seen them. Heavy brows, long noses, lips set in a flat line that somehow looks a little disappointed in you. The biggest ones weigh 80 tons. And for most of the last 50 years, the story we told about the people who carved them was a very particular kind of story. It was a warning. It goes like this. A group of Polynesian voyagers find this island, and it is paradise. A forest of palm trees, millions of them, covering the whole place. Deep soil, seabirds nesting everywhere, so tame you can pick them up. And the people thrive. The population climbs. And somewhere along the way, they start carving. Carving becomes the thing. Rival clans competing, each one trying to outbuild the others. Statues getting bigger and more ambitious. And every single one has to be moved from the quarry in the volcano to a platform on the coast, which takes timber, rollers, sledges, ropes, scaffolding, tree after tree after tree. Until one day, somebody on that island cut down the last palm tree. And then, in the story, everything comes apart. No trees means no canoes. No canoes means no deep water fishing. No roots means the topsoil starts washing into the sea. Crops fail, the birds disappear. And a people who spent 3 centuries building monuments to their own importance turn on each other. Warfare, famine, in the grimmest telling, cannibalism. They pull down their own statues in rage. And when European ships finally show up, they find a starving remnant living in the wreckage of something they destroyed with their own hands. It is a devastating story. It is also probably the most repeated environmental parable of the last half-century. Easter Island became shorthand, a whole planet in miniature, sitting alone in the ocean with nowhere to run. Look what happens when a society eats its own home. There is one problem with it. Almost none of it survives contact with the evidence. Let me start with the part that unravels everything else, the timing. For a long time, the assumption was that people arrived on Rapa Nui somewhere around the year 400, maybe as late as 800. That gives you 1,000 years of occupation. 1,000 years is plenty of room for a slow rise, a golden age, a long, ugly decline, and a collapse. But when archaeologists went back and radiocarbon dated the earliest reliable material, the ones from actual human activity rather than mixed-up deposits, the date moved hard. The best current evidence puts the first settlers at around the year 1200, which sounds like a small correction. It is not. It means that by the time Europeans arrived in 1722, the entire history of human life on Easter Island was about 500 years. And in those 500 years, these people arrived on bare volcanic rock in the middle of nowhere, figured out how to farm it, and carved and moved 900 multi-ton statues. That is not the timeline of a civilization that slowly rotted. That is a sprint. So what happened to the trees? Because that part is real. There was a forest. There is no forest now. The Rapa Nui palm, a huge tree related to the Chilean wine palm, is completely extinct. We only know it existed from pollen cores and from the nuts preserved in the soil. And here is where the story gets interesting, because it turns out the people were not working alone. When Polynesian voyagers set out, they do not travel light and they do not travel alone. The canoes carry taro, sweet potato, chickens, everything you need to build a world from scratch. And along with all of it, every single time, there is a stowaway, the Pacific rat. Now put a breeding pair of rats on an island with unlimited food and not one single predator. Under those conditions, a rat population can double roughly every 7 weeks. Within a few years, you are not talking about hundreds of rats. You are talking about millions. And what did that palm tree produce? Big, oily, nutritious nuts. Sitting on the ground, waiting. Archaeologists have pulled thousands of those ancient palm nuts out of the soil on Rapa Nui, and a huge proportion of them have the exact same damage. Gnaw marks, rodent teeth right through the shell into the seed. So yes, people cleared land. People always clear land. That is what farming is. But the forest was not simply being cut down. It was being prevented from ever growing back. Every seed that hit the ground got eaten. And a forest that cannot reproduce is a forest on a countdown, one that nobody living through it would necessarily register as a crisis, because across a single human life, the trees just get slightly scarcer. Fine, you might say. The mechanism is different, but the outcome is the same. Trees gone, society collapses. Except the collapse is the part that is hardest to actually find. Think about what a society tearing itself apart would leave behind. Fortifications, mass graves, skeletons carrying the specific injuries of violence, cracked skulls, defensive fractures on the forearms. Researchers went looking. What they found does not match. Studies of the skeletal remains turn up very little lethal trauma. Injuries, certainly, because life was physical and hard. But the signature of a population dying in organized violence is largely absent. And then there are the spear points. This was one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the war story. Scattered across Easter Island are thousands of sharp obsidian objects called mataa, and for decades they were described as weapons, proof of an arms race in the final desperate years. So a team sat down and studied their shape properly, hundreds of them measured and compared. And the mataa are the wrong shape to be weapons, wide and blunt at the tip, rather than narrow and piercing. If you wanted to kill a person with one, you would be choosing a bad tool. What they look like, in form and in wear, is a general-purpose cutting and scraping implement, something for working plants and processing food. The island's arsenal, on closer inspection, was mostly a very large collection of knives. And behind all of this sits a bigger point. The Rapa Nui were not helplessly watching their environment fail. They were engineering their way through it. Across the island, there are fields covered in broken volcanic rock. For a long time, this looked like exactly what the collapse story predicted. Barren ground, ruined soil. It is the opposite. They were deliberately shattering rock and spreading it over their gardens. The technique is called lithic mulching, and it works beautifully. The stones cut evaporation, shelter seedlings from that relentless ocean wind, buffer the temperature swings, and as they weather, they release minerals back into the soil. That is not a society in freefall. That is a society that looked at a hard, windy, drying island and figured out how to farm it anyway. And then there is my favorite piece of the whole thing, which is the statues themselves. The old story needs enormous quantities of timber to move the moai, laid down as rollers, dragged horizontally by hundreds of people. It is the engine of the entire deforestation narrative. But the Rapa Nui had their own account of how the statues got to the coast, and they had been giving it to visitors for a very long time. They said the moai walked. For most of a century, this was filed away as myth, a nice piece of folklore. Of course they did not walk. Then, in 2012, a team built a full-scale replica, about 4.5 tons, and tried something. 3 ropes, 2 teams on either side, 1 behind, and they rocked it. Left, right, and the statue's own weight and its carefully shaped rounded base did the rest. It tipped forward onto the next edge with every swing. It walked. Upright, down the road, at a decent pace, with 18 people on the ropes. The moai are carved with a forward lean and a curved belly, which makes no sense if you plan to lay them flat, and perfect sense if you plan to walk them. The oral tradition was not a metaphor. It was a set of instructions, and we had been ignoring it for 100 years because we assumed we understood the problem better than the people who solved it. So if the island did not collapse, what actually happened here? The answer is not mysterious. It is documented, with dates and names and ship manifests. It is just not the story anyone wanted to tell. In 1722, a Dutch expedition under Jacob Roggeveen arrived on an Easter Sunday, which is where the European name comes from. They found a functioning society. Later visitors describe cultivated fields and people in reasonable health. Then in 1862, ships arrived from Peru looking for labor for guano mines and plantations. What followed was a series of slave raids. Over roughly a year, an estimated 1,500 people were taken off Rapa Nui. That was close to half the population. And it was not a random half. Among the people taken were the king, his heir, and the men who held the island's specialized knowledge. Rapa Nui had a writing system, a script called Rongo Rongo, carved into wooden tablets. It is the only writing system known from anywhere in Polynesia. We still cannot read it. We probably never will, because the small number of people who could were removed from the island inside a single year and did not come back. International pressure eventually forced the return of some of the survivors. A handful made it home. They carried smallpox with them. By 1877, the population of Easter Island was 111 people. That is the collapse. Not centuries of self-inflicted decline. 15 years, and it came off the boats. Now, I want to be fair here, because this is still an active argument, and not every archaeologist has landed in the same place. There are researchers who defend a version of the older account, and the honest position is that the island's history is contested. But the direction of travel in the evidence has been one way for 20 years. In 2024, a team sequenced ancient Rapa Nui genomes looking specifically for the fingerprint that a massive population crash leaves in a gene pool. Population bottlenecks are extremely hard to hide from genetics. They did not find one before European contact. Which leaves the real question, and it is not really a question about the island. Why did we believe the other story so completely? Because look at what the collapse version does. It takes an island where roughly half the population was carried off in chains and the rest were killed by imported disease, and it hands the blame to the victims. It says they did this to themselves. They were reckless, they were vain, they built too many statues, and they got what was coming. That is an extraordinarily comfortable story if you happen to be from the part of the world that sent the ships. And it spread everywhere. Textbooks, bestsellers, TED Talks, 1,000 school essays about sustainability. I have repeated a version of it myself. You may have too. Not out of malice. It is just a better story, in the narrow sense that it has a tidy moral and a clean shape. And stories with tidy morals travel further than stories with slave ships in them. Here is the part I actually want to leave you with. We talk about the Rapa Nui in the past tense, the vanished islanders, the lost civilization. It is baked into how the story gets told. They are not gone. There are thousands of Rapa Nui people alive right now, on that island and around the world, and they trace back through those 111 survivors. They came back from 111. They have their language. They have their island. They are still there. And for a century and a half, they have lived alongside a story told confidently by outsiders and printed in books all over the world that says their ancestors were fools who murdered their own home. That story only got corrected because somebody bothered to check. Somebody went back and dug, and counted rat-bitten seeds, and measured obsidian, and walked a statue down a road to see if it could be done. So the next time you meet a clean, satisfying story about a people who destroyed themselves, you already know the question to ask. Not whether it is tidy, whether the people in it got to tell it.